Hey, good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to our call for tonight. And I'm gonna try to stream this. Gonna try to go ahead and stream this on Restream also, in case you want to view this on. Um, doesn't look like it's showing up over there yet, but oh, never mind that. I won't worry too much about that. If it goes over there, it goes over there. If it does not, it does not. But in any case, welcome. And this is our weekend Q&A. What we want to do is I will take your questions, and I do have a couple of questions from Ultimate Insider, so I'm going to go with those. And then with whatever time I have left, I'll take your questions about anything that you are doing, whether or not it's with your PLR or in your online business. Happy to take your questions and do with them what I can. Let me turn on the Q&A and the chat, and we'll be good to go. All right. Okay, yep, I got your question there, Jim. Got it on screen. So it'll be a second up here. Okay, so just so that you'll know, our Conquer Procrastination PLR has been released. You can get that at theplrshow.com/CPWSL. If you are an Ultimate Insider, that course is already in your course inventory. The entire funnel is placed there as of the beginning of this week, and so just so that you'll know. So if you're an Ultimate Insider, you don't have to. You shouldn't be using Warrior Plus anyway, but you can just access your course area to have access to the course. All right, so let's dive right into it. Um, I have a question here, I think, and the question is, um, how long does it usually take for one's first Warrior Plus product offer to be approved? Um, I'm gonna say um, you want to give it 24 to 48 hours. And so when you submit it, you want to have everything ready. So you want to have the buy buttons on there. You want to have them validated. And when I mean by validated, there's a place inside of your Warrior Plus offer where you can validate each page so that Warrior Plus says that if an affiliate sends traffic there, that page will go to where it says it is. So you'll see it inside of the course area there. You want to make sure all the pages in your funnel are validated. You want to make sure that uh, the product is ready to be delivered. So in other words, when you're setting up the product inside of Warrior Plus, that they should be able to go in there and get your product. And that's even if your product is going to be going to a member area, if you're going to have it tied up someplace, then you want to give them access to it. And typically, what I do is I set up an ID that has my email address, but but it gives them the login and password. And the reason I do that is because um, I don't want them to have to confirm an email address because sometimes, an email will go someplace and they can't confirm it. So I put my own email address in there, but they should still be able to log in, get access to the member area or member course or whatever it is, and then get access to your product. So that all that needs to be set up ahead of time. So pretty much it should be ready to sell. Now, as you as you go further, I, if I think you could probably get away with maybe not having a final sales page, and in most cases, um, they're still going to look over your sales page. The other thing is that you want to have when you validate, you have to have the um, disclosure in there. So you got to have your disclosures in there. You got to have your privacy policy and all those things on your page. All those things should be ready to go before you submit to approval. Um, the other thing is now before you can submit anyway, you got to declare a launch date. So the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to put a date in the offer settings. You're going to have a date and a time that it goes live. That's the first step. Once that's set up, then you can go and you can submit um, to Warrior Plus. What it's going to say is going to take him 24 to 48 hours, 1, 3 business days. I'm going to say that if it's your first product, you want to be ready 48 hours. You want to submit that no less than 48 hours before you go live. You can probably get by with 24 once you've done a couple of product launches. And so that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say 48 hours. No, don't try to don't try to go beyond that. So in other words, don't try to get into 47, 46, you, 2 days out, some no later than 2 days out. You want to go ahead and submit that offer to Warrior Plus, have everything ready. Okay, and I think I'm not sure if Dana's there or not out there or not, but hopefully that will be helpful to you. Okay, next question is from Jim, and he had some questions about images and about some places where you can go to have images done. I'm going to run through just a few things that I put together based on his question. Um, if you know how to use an image editor or you can edit images, that's obviously going to be helpful. You can do that with Photoshop. Most people don't use Photoshop. These days, a lot of people are mad at Photoshop. I'm personally not mad at Photoshop, but some people are mad at Photoshop because of their terms of service. But I'm not going to get into that here. Some people use Affinity as a substitute for Photoshop. Other people use Canva, and so you can use any of those things to edit an image that may not be quite what you want. That if you can just make some tweaks to it, you can typically use one of those three. So anything that you're given in terms of an AI image is you want to have an image editor because as of right at this moment, out of the box, unless you really work with it, and sometimes unless you get really fortunate, the DALL-E engine, which is the one that most of the image creators use in order to create AI images, still does not know how to spell out of the box. You can work with it, and I think I've done a bonus in the past on how to get DALL-E to spell. It is possible, but it is not easy to do, and you've got to do a couple of different iterations. The fastest thing to do is to get DALL-E or whatever image I'll tell you where you're going to get this done. The fastest way to do this is to have DALL-E create the great image, and then if it puts words on there, then you can go ahead and just edit it in one of these image editors. Now, another way to go about this is to specify and make sure that DALL-E does not put any letters on there. And then you're going to go back with the image editor and you'll put the letters on there. That's really the easiest and the fastest than trying to go back and correct something that DALL-E does. Let me see. Somebody's typing here. Yeah, and Dana says she's found Snagit. That's a good point. Snagit is also very good. I use Snagit pretty much every day to resize images, right? To do those things. So, well, Jim, if you use Photoshop, then you're going to be fine. So, whatever you get from DALL-E, you're going to go into Photoshop and just do some editing to it. Now, that being said, there are a couple of places to do this. Um, I will say that uh, you want to get good at image prompting. You want to get inside of Chat GPT to get an actual image prompt. So in other words, you go in Chat GPT, regardless of where you create it, and this is whether you do it in Chat GPT or whether you do it in Midjourney, you want to go inside of there and get image prompts. So if you know how to operate a GPT, there are GPTs. If you just type in prompt, you can find a good place to get prompts inside of GPT, or you don't even have to use a GPT to get a good image prompt. You can just go in, ask Chat GPT for a good prompt or a photorealistic prompt for whatever it is that you're looking for. And then it's going to give you sometimes a long one, but you want to specify if it's going to be for Midjourney. So let's say that you want a prompt for Midjourney, then you want to tell it that you want a prompt for Midjourney for whatever it is you want to be as detailed as you want as you can be. Just understand that when you are asking for a prompt, you are asking a machine for it. So you don't have to put a lot of extra, inflections that you would put if you were talking to a human being because you're not talking to a human being. You're trying to talk to a machine. So you don't want to have any more information in there. You want to have a lot of noise in what you write. You want to write it as if you are writing to a machine. It doesn't have emotions. It doesn't care. It's just, even if it, writes back like it sounds like it cares, it's a machine that doesn't care about anything. So you want to write to it like you're writing to a machine when you're asking for a prompt. So get the image prompt I suggest from Chat GPT. Um, and then also there are GPTs that have image prompts. I wonder if I can just show you, right? And it'll find prompts for you, right? So just you can pick one of these. Typically, I don't have any science to this. I try to pick the one that people use the most. Like you can see here, somebody has a mid-journey prompt generator. 400,000 people have used it. There's some that have been used 25,000 times, some 100,000 times. If it's like 100,000, it probably means that people have used it more than once. So it's probably a decent one. Let's just see if that one has 25. This one has 400,000. Let's see what the reviews are. Okay, so 4 out of 4.4 out of 5. So a lot of people must go and come back over and over again to use these mid-journey prompts, right? So I think even even above which engine you use, I think the most important thing is to get the prompts and to get the AI to give you the right prompts, right? And if you get an AI to give you the prompt, it's going to have details in there for that medium that you wouldn't think of otherwise, right? So that's really over and above which place. I think that the most important thing is going to be getting the AI to give you the prompt. Okay. Um, and you can also use Claude. Like I use Claude for some things. Um, and Claude's newest model is probably more robust than Chat GPT, than GPT-4, right? It does some things better. Now, Chad, um, it does not do images, not create images, but what it produces, it can produce a prompt for an image, right? And produces very good results in terms of an AI. So to recap, you got some place to do image, got some place to edit the images. You get your image prompts from an AI. Then there are lots of different places. You can get it from ChatGPT. You can go to Midjourney. You can go to Microsoft Copilot. All those are, I think, Midjourney is not free. ChatGPT, you can use a free version. Microsoft Copilot, you can use a free version, right? So any one of those. So let's just say I'll show you something I did earlier. Let me see if I can find that. Okay. Um, okay. So when I got ready to create the bonus for you and Callie's um, product, and I wanted the image representing what I was going to create. So what I said was I want the 1%. I like, what did I ask it for? I asked it for draw an image of a recording that I am doing called the 1% principle for information and expertise marketers. Now, and it gave me this one, which was okay. That didn't spell right, right? So it didn't spell very well. And so I always go back, right? And I ask, if it'll do a better job of that. What I ended up doing was taking this image and putting it inside of Photoshop, wiping out the writing, right? And then writing on top of it with a font from Photoshop. Now, actually, Photoshop AI has its own AI. So ironically, and I don't want to open up Photoshop on here. That'll be a disaster. But you can go into Photoshop and you can type in a prompt and you can tell Photoshop what to do with your image. So that is what I did. So I went into Photoshop, I highlighted the image there, and I said, "Okay, get rid of the words." Right. So I didn't try to find the right thing. I just said take out the take out the words, make it blank so I can write on it. And that's what it did. And it didn't take a couple of times to figure it out. It just did that. So in general, if you can, if you can get uh, the image into something that you can probably um, you can probably change it to what you need it to be. So I would say of the three choices, if you get the prompts right, you can do it inside of Chat GPT. You can do it inside of Midjourney. You can even do it with Microsoft Copilot. Um, let's just let's see what we can do here. Let's see what we can do. Uh, okay, so we're inside of Chat GPT. Somebody want to give me what you want. So let's just kind of test the theory. So we're gonna go. I'm gonna take your idea, whatever your idea is. I'm gonna go and get the prompt, and then we're gonna see what ChatGPT does with the prompt that it gives us. So anybody have something that they want to have created, or what do you want to see? And then I'm gonna go get the prompt. So maybe somebody have an idea of what you want to say. Let me know what you want to say. You can type it into the chat box, or you can type it into the Q&A box. Either way. Let's see. Oh, Jim's question is, do I have a course on Midjourney? Yes, I do. I do have one, and it is in your uh, and it is discounted for you as an Ultimate Insider, Jim. Okay, so a Spartan Warrior stock market chart with a theme of "We Grow Together." Okay, so let's see what we can do with that. So let's go. Let's go to Explore GPTs, and then let's go. Um, let's first start with image prompt, or let's just start with image prompts. I'm going to say for Chat GPT. Let's see what it comes up with. Let's take out the for Chat GPT. Let's just type in image prompt. Okay, so we've got one that is image prompt generator, and that's about 10,000, right? So let's just do that. Let's see, I grab Midjourney. Okay, that GPT didn't like that. Let's just go back to let's just go to Chat GPT. All right, let's just ask for a prompt. Prompt for and let's first do this. Let's go with let's ask first, do you have any clarifying questions for me? And that's something you should always do. Clarifying questions for me. So Jim, you're gonna have to answer these questions for me. Um, okay, so the first question is, would you like the Spartan warrior to be depicted in a historical or modern setting? That's question number one. Let me put all these questions. I'm going to put all these questions in the chat. And so I'm going to put all these questions in the chat, and then you can answer them. And then I will answer, and then we'll go back and create the image. So let's put this on. Okay, so I've got the clarifying question. So just so that you'll know, if you're doing this, it's a good practice to do that before you actually ask for your results, before you get the results, you go back and you ask the machine, you ask Chat GPT if it has questions about what it needs to know in order to create a good image. Okay, so let me see what Jim's got written here. Okay, so let's see. He says historical settings, background, last question, no. Okay, so historical settings, background, And last question, no. Okay. Well, let's see what happens here. Okay, so is that sort of what you want, Jim, or what are you looking for? Okay. Okay, well, if you write if you write me after the session, I'll just send you these. Right? Okay, good. So that's pretty much anybody else let's see, we've got 7 minutes. So who else has an example? Let's try it again. So um who else has an image that you want to just create? We're just going to use Chat GPT. Any ideas of what you want to do? So anybody can type into the chat box or the question and answer box. Okay. Let's try modern image of a Spartan warrior with blue and orange school colors. Okay. I'm gonna post the replay to I'm gonna play. I'm gonna post a replay in the Ultimate Insider area. I'm also gonna place a replay on YouTube. So it'll be in two places. I'll be sending it out tonight. So it'll be ready sometime tonight. Okay, so let's say please prompt for please provide a prompt for modern image of Spartan warrior with blue and orange school colors. And let's ask our clarifying question. We're going to say, first, do you have any clarifying questions uh, for me to answer? Okay, so I'm going to post these. I'm going to put these questions in the chat. And if you can answer them, then we will we will go from there. In general, this you want to ask the clarifying questions. If you're watching this and you're not interested in images, you should be asking these questions regardless of what you're asking for. So if you're asking for, let's say, you want to ask Chat GPT to write you a headline or to rewrite your headline for your sales page. The first thing you do before you get results is you ask, does it have questions for you? And you want to answer its questions in detail, right? Okay, so let's see. So Jim's answers are, let's see, modern school setting, and no. All right, I'm just gonna put these in here and no. All right. Okay, there we go. Let's see what happens. It just skips the prompts. All right. Okay, so I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for, Jim. But anyway, now you can just use the procedure, right, to uh, inside of Chat GPT in order to do it. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Doesn't have to be about images. Doesn't have to be about Chat GPT. Any other questions? Well, everybody, it is 7:28. You're out of here a little early tonight, and I hope that this is helpful for you. Few things to mention here. Um, Once again, conquer procrastination. You can get that at the plrshow.com/CPWSL. That's going to be a couple more days at the launch price, right? And then I think we're doing Claude on Wednesday. I think we're doing Claude on Wednesday. Um, Tonight now the image that I was creating was you'll see it on this page. Like if you go to this page, you'll see the image that I created um, to depict what I'm going to be doing for this bonus. And tonight just happens to be the last night for launch pricing. I did not say that in my newsletter today. So just so you'll know, tonight's the last night for launch pricing. You can get that and our bonus at theplrshow.com/you and Kelly. And Nelson is doing this thing called cooking for kids. And as I said in my newsletter, this is not my thing necessarily because we did not give our uh, kids recipes, right? So, Laurel just had them cooking, right out as an adult, right? For what it's worth. And then Justin Ope, which is Sajan's old partner, he's got personal development PLR at the plrshow.com/Justin O. And I would be remiss if I did not say that the very best that we have to offer is for you to become an ultimate insider. In fact, conquer procrastination. There are 3 offers in the funnel. All those are going to be yours at no cost when you become an ultimate insider, just so that you will know. And okay, so really that is it. If there are no more questions, we are at 7:30 on the dot. Okay, so with that, thank you very much, everybody, for hanging out with me here. I hope that you all have a great weekend, have a great night, and a pleasant tomorrow. Take care.